Well, hello, Stacey Murphy here with a video on choosing your crops. So I'm going to recommend vegetables for you, and I'm going to let you know how to source your seeds and your transplants. And so this is a way to work with nature and get off to a really great start. So first you want to familiarize yourself with the vegetable and herb families. Get to know these plant families because they share common growing styles. So it's helpful to know these families. And so when you are choosing your vegetables and your varieties, one of the things that you want to understand is that this can be very dependent on your climate and local conditions. So you want to ask your local gardeners, your local farmers. If you live in the United States, there's something called the Cooperative Extension. You can look that up and give them a call. They can give you some guidance. And you can also call seed companies. It's in their best interest to make sure that you do well so that you come back and order from them again. Obviously, they want to sell you something, but it's in their best interest to give you good information. And so just take, a note here that when you go into your garden store or your local big box store, sometimes they'll have these giant seed displays. And just because something is there on a seed display does not mean that it's perfect for your local conditions, because oftentimes these are standard displays that they order and it's not necessarily specific to location. So keep that in mind. Just because something is on the shelf doesn't mean it's the right time to plant it or the right crop for you. So one big indicator that you are on the right path, look at the farmer's market, look to see what seedlings are available at the farmer's market, and these are things that most likely are the right things to grow at the right time. And when you're assessing whether a crop is right for you, these are the different questions that I ask myself and to determine which crops I want to grow. And I've given you a worksheet which basically has all of those questions, and you can take this worksheet. I recommend going to the farmers market or a gardening meetup and basically ask local growers which varieties they grow and if they can help you fill out the spreadsheet. Hopefully it'll only take you 15 minutes and you're going to get a lot of information, and if you write it down, it's very helpful. If you just ask the farmers which varieties they grow and why, and you don't write anything down, you're going to forget the details. So I recommend writing this all down. All right, so recommended crops. If you're going to grow a lot of food in 40 days, so this first 40 days, what the things that you're going to turn to are things that are fast, high yield, and small, because in general, we're talking about small plot growing. We're finding 100 square feet, we're growing a lot of food. So the things that are fast, things like radishes, can be ready in 21 days with the right conditions. Bok choy, lettuce, cress, sprouts and shoots, and lettuce mix. Those are all things that can be ready within 28 days, some of them less. Sprouts and shoots can be ready in 10 days. All right, next category is high yield. So these are things that might grow slow at first, but over time they're going to continue to give you produce. These are things like chard, kale, collards, and then all of your herbs, and then also callaloo, which is a Jamaican spinach. It's an amaranth family. And these are all things that you're basically going to cut every week, and it's going to keep growing back. So at first you might not get huge harvests out of these plants, but over time you're going to get so much food off these plants because they just keep coming and coming. And then plants that are small, these are plants that you can tuck in around lots of other crops, and you can really pack in the plants to grow a lot. Some of these are longer maturing, but what makes them great is that they're small. So spinach, arugula, celery, leeks, bunching onions, beets, turnips, dill, cilantro, thyme, and rosemary. These are all things that you can tuck in, and you can grow baby bunching onions. You don't have to wait for them to grow into full maturity. In 40 days, you can harvest them and eat them, whatever size they are. Same thing with spinach, arugula, celery, and leeks. All right. So the next stage is to think about beyond 40 days. So there are things that you might want to plant for later. So if you're somebody who has their eye on the longer game and you're looking beyond 40 days, the other crops that are recommended for small plot growing, things that are high yield, and these days to maturity range from 45 to 100 days from the time that you transplant them. So these are things that you might buy seedlings at a nursery and then transplant them, and you might wait 45 to 100 days. Cucumbers, tomatoes, eggplant, summer squash, zucchini, these are all high yielding vegetables. You're going to get lots of poundage out of these. And then you can try to get some of these with higher yields more quickly. And those crops, tomatoes and eggplant, there are different varieties where they can mature quicker. Sun Gold tomatoes, Early Girls, are two of the earliest tomatoes I know, and they produce a lot of produce, so they're nice producers. Eggplant, some of the Asian varieties, Orient Express is a fast producer and a large producer, so you might want to consider choosing a variety based on how much fruit you're going to get and how quickly. And then crops that are small, peppers, hot peppers, and garlic. These are things that you might only harvest the garlic once. You might not get as much yield out of peppers and hot peppers as you do tomatoes and eggplant, but they are definitely worth growing, and you'll get definitely some delicious produce. Now, crops that may be worth growing beyond that 40 days, where yield is significant enough. These are things like smaller but long maturing plants, carrots. These won't be ready in 40 days unless you plant a very specific variety that are ready at 40 days, and you can pull them out of the ground at 40 days and they taste good. Most carrots are going to be ready more like 55 or 60 days or longer. Crowd pleasers, people love broccoli, and you can harvest the head and the leaves. And these things, the fastest I've ever seen broccoli come in is maybe 50 days from transplant. Peas and beans, you can get them in around 45 days from transplant. So that's another crop that's worth it, in my opinion, to put into the ground. And it improves the soil, which is another big benefit. And then there's long maturing but hefty crops, and I like to plant cabbage because it's a really hefty, high yield crop. The fastest cabbage I've ever seen is 45 days from transplant. Typically they're more like 60. And then reasons you may not want to grow certain crops, and there are lots of reasons why you might not want to grow certain crops. Something that's not listed here is that water conditions or heat conditions, those are things that might prevent you from growing something. But other reasons is that things like okra, beans, and peas, these are things that are small and tiny and a little bit harder to harvest. And so you don't get a whole lot of harvest per plant. So a lot of people, if you don't have a big space, sometimes it's not necessarily that worth it to grow those crops. If you have a small space, it's not necessarily worth it to grow something that's sprawling. Things like winter squash, melons, Brussels sprouts, corn, and okra. These are things that take up quite a bit of space. Long maturing crops, corn, fully mature onions. You can grow baby onions, but fully mature onions take a long time. Pumpkins, these are all things that are 100 days, 120 days. So it might not be worth it if you don't want to wait that long, or you don't have a season that's that long. And then other reasons you might not want to grow something, pest and disease susceptibility. So I don't like growing zucchini and summer squash because of the squash vine borer. It's too much work to try to stay ahead of it. So I have a different crop that I grow if I have the space. I grow what's called a squash gourd called tromponcini. It's a delicious squash gourd that I replace all my squash with. All right, so when you are picking your temperature or picking your vegetables, remember that you have to look at what temperatures. So if you're growing for the next 40 days, you want to look at what temperatures are going to occur in the next 40 days on average in your area. So what are the typical climatic conditions in your area? There might be a cold snap, there might be a warm snap, but what's typical? And you want to choose your crops appropriately. One thing to note is with heat sensitivity, I mentioned that lettuce, cilantro, and spinach are really great crops to grow. They're fast, they're small, but if you are in an area where things get hot quickly, then you might want to replace those with Mediterranean and tropical crops. Replace your lettuces with radicchio, endive, and chicory. Replace your cilantro with papalo and epazote, which are other crops that have a similar flavor to cilantro but hold up to the heat. Replace your spinach with callaloo, which is a Jamaican spinach in the amaranth family, or Malabar spinach, which is a vining spinach. It's very delicious. So you want to keep an eye on that heat and modify appropriately. Now, when you are choosing your crops, it's good to plant a lot of things together. And I mentioned this when in the video of planning out your planting bed. You're going to hear more about companion plants and that there's not much bad company in the vegetable garden. So take a look at that. And one thing I would recommend is that if you can, get up to 30% of your bed with flowers and herbs, and that's going to ensure that you get lots of beneficial insects, and you're going to have to do less work in the long run. So these are all things, a lot of the herbs are great things to add to your food, and a lot of the flowers and herbs on this list are medicine as well. So companion planting to help control those insects, but then also to provide more deliciousness on your plate and some medicine. All right, so that's choosing your crops. The next question is, how do you choose seeds? And there's really only one thing that I would caution against when you're choosing a seed source. When you're just getting started, there are lots of great manufacturers of seeds, and there is a list of those in your workbook. Now, the one thing that you want to be conscious of is what's the difference between a hybrid and a GMO. So, a lot of people are steering clear of genetically modified seeds. And the good news is when you're a gardener, there's not a lot of genetically modified seeds that you're going to come across. This is the good news. You're going to come across hybrids, which are things that happen in the wild. Hybrids happen where two plants are crossed to get the best genes from both of those plants. That is much different than what happens with a GMO. A GMO is created in a laboratory with gene splicing. The consequences are unknown. This doesn't happen in the wild. So those are things that we don't want to play around with. But the hybrids, they're all working in our favor. They're combining and crossing two lettuce plants in order to get the best possible lettuce for you. So that's the difference between hybrids and GMOs. And so the only crops you really need to be careful of with genetically modified seeds are corn, soy, alfalfa, which is usually for livestock only, squash, and papaya seeds. And what you'll notice is that squash is really the only thing on this list that you're probably going to grow in your garden. And so you want to be careful of these specific varieties. Yellow straight neck, yellow crookneck, and green zucchini squash seeds are available as GMOs under Monsanto's vegetable seed brand Seminis. And there are non-genetically modified versions of those also available. So you just want to double check that you have the right ones, or don't pick this particular brand and you know that you'll be safe. And then the other thing around seeds is that you really just want to check the date on the packet. And seeds are useful for many years as long as they were kept cool. So if you know that the seeds are just within the last couple of years and they were kept cool, then most likely they are going to work for you. If they were left out in the sun, they might not be viable anymore. If they were left somewhere and got wet, they might not be viable anymore. But other than that, the seeds should be good. And if you're using seeds and they're older and you're not sure what conditions they were kept in, double the amount of seed that you use in order to ensure that you get a good germination rate. All right, so that's choosing seeds. Now the next thing is choosing transplants, and I recommend if you're a beginner, use as many seedlings whenever possible. These are teenage plants. They're already off to a really healthy start, and this is going to ensure that you get food faster and that you're starting with really healthy plants. So this is always a great place to start for beginners. And remember, lots of crops are have the ability to be transplanted. So look at this list. The only things that I don't recommend transplants are the things that are crossed off, and it's literally 5 crops on this list. Everything else can be transplanted. So the more you can buy transplants, the faster you're going to get food, and the easier it is going to be for you to grow that food because you're off to a healthy start. So choosing good quality transplants is important. How do you know that it's healthy? So the first thing you're going to look for is to make sure that there's no flower buds. You want plants that are about 6 inches tall, and this is when they are the best value. When they start to get taller, they start to charge you a lot more money for them. And make sure there's no flowers, because that ensures that the seedling has been in the vegetative state, which is its young period. It's growing roots and it's growing greens. You do not want it to be flowering in these tiny pots. Second thing you want to look for is that the leaves have good, strong color. And you want to make sure that they are bushy, that they aren't just a couple leaves. Make sure they look nice and vigorous. And then with those leaves, you want to look for this well-branched structure so that it's not tall and spindly, it's nice and bushy. All right, so that's what you're looking for with the leaves. Next thing you're looking for is the roots. And you can pull these plants out of the plastic containers and look at the roots. You want to make sure that it's not root bound. The image on the right is a root bound transplant. Those roots are strangling themselves. They're wrapped around really, really tightly. The roots on the left are perfect. you can unravel those just a little bit and plant that, and that's going to just take off in the ground. And then you want to make sure that the roots hold soil. So when you pull it out of the packet, if the soil falls away from the roots, that means that they haven't been keeping the plants moist enough, and that's not something that you want to mess with. The third thing is that you want to make sure that the roots are white. Any other color signifies that it might be a disease. If it's brown or yellow, it signifies that you might not have a healthy plant. All right, and then the next thing is to look at the media, the growing media. So you want to make sure that it's moist. If you're at the store and everything is dried out, that's a sign that they might let it dry out quite a bit and that the seeds might be, or the plants might be a little bit stressed out. So make sure it's moist. If it's too moist, algae will form and little green things will start to form. So if you start to see algae growing, that's a sign that you might be battling diseases later because the transplant started out too moist. So you want just right. All right. And the final thing you want to look at for are any signs of pests or diseases. So you want to make sure there's no bite marks, no discolorations, and of course make sure there's no actual physical pests right on the plant. And then when you are looking for these transplants, the question is, do you trust the source? And figure out what questions you need to ask to feel confident that you have the seedlings you want. I have bought seedlings from farmers markets. I have bought seedlings from Home Depot. And basically, I'm making sure that I'm picking the brightest, healthiest, most vigorous plants I can find. And, if you only have one place, let's say, if you only have a big box like Home Depot, you pick the best plants that you can find. If you do have access to somebody and you can ask them questions about whether or not they grew these organically without chemicals, that sort of thing, what if they did add any chemicals, why did they add them? That's an important question to ask because their answer might surprise you and it might sound okay to you. So ask any questions you can, but if you only have one place to buy your seedlings, pick the brightest, most vibrant plants you can find, and most likely you're going to do really well.